Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming here to this talk that has been organized by the PRBB Good Scientific Practice Working Group. This is a talk on publication ethics and open science mostly. And it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker, Iratxe Puebla. She's a biochemist by training. That she studied in the Basque Country, and then soon after that moved to the UK to start working in publishing. So that's where we met. So after my PhD, I work as an editor in genome biology, and actually she was one of the people who interviewed me. So we go back a long way. So I moved out and continued another path, but she stayed in publishing. So she has a very long experience for over 20 years. She was in Biomed Central, then in PLOS one, and she's currently at ASAPbio. She's the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Community. I don't know if this was working before. So she's really has a lot of experience and expertise in publishing, and she's also, well, she will tell you herself, but she's also involved in COPE, which is the Committee of Ethics in Publications. So she's involved in not only in the publishing world, but also specifically in integrity and ethics. And today she's going to be talking about the integrity challenges in publications and how we can solve them, and in particular through open science. So thank you very much, Iratxe. We will leave questions for the end, and those of you who are following us online, you can write your questions in the chat, and then we'll deal with everything at the end. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marusa. And let me know if at any point I'm doing anything wrong with the microphone. But yes, good morning, bon dia, and thank you for the opportunity, Marusa and the PRBB, to be here today to speak about research integrity, which I think is a very timely subject, as well as open science. So I'm hoping that essentially feel free to react at the end with any comments, questions, etc. Right, so to get started, I thought I would speak a little bit about ASAPbio for anybody who may not be familiar with the organization. We are a small non-profit with a mission to make life sciences communication faster and more transparent. We have two main areas of focus. One is that we support the productive use of preprints in the life sciences. We want to encourage researchers to consider preprints as a communication path for their research. And the other area in which we work is that we try to support openness and transparency in peer review. So we're also, for example, interested in transparency in peer review journals, but also preprint review, because it kind of links the two areas of focus. To drive our work towards our mission, we have different areas of activities. We run convenings. Essentially, we work with a lot of stakeholders interested in the preprints space to develop new resources, talk about best practices, explore areas where there may be challenges around the development of preprints. We also do a lot of work with our community. We have the ASAPbio community, which is a global group of researchers and anybody who's interested in preprints who can join and participate in our events and projects. And we also try to develop public resources. They're all posted on our website and the open licenses, because what we want is to really empower researchers to make those decisions as to how to use preprints, etc., and to also develop resources for others for whom preprints or open peer review may be relevant, so editors, etc. So that's a little bit about ASAPbio. But before I get started, I also wanted to mention a few other activities, and for full disclosure, as well, all the experience, but also potential biases that I bring into my presentation. As Marusa mentioned, I'm Facilitation and Integrity Officer for the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, which is a membership organization for journals and publishers that develop resources and, again, guidelines about how to handle publication ethics issues in journal submission and publications. I will not go through all of the list, but another area that I wanted to highlight that I've been involved in over the last 2 years or so is that I'm also co-leading the working group hosted within Force 11 that is a collaboration with COPE as well, but where we have a focus on developing guidelines and best practices around the publication of data specifically, so a bit more diverse versus journal publications. Right, but we're here to talk about research integrity, and I thought I would start talking about the so-called reproducibility crisis in science. There's been a lot of talk about this for over a decade now. I'm pretty sure that you must have all heard about the reproducibility crisis label and tag. A lot of discussion. I mentioned this paper that I think probably everybody has read by now. That suggested that actually due to the issues as to how research is currently designed, reported, and analyzed, there is some consensus as to whether actually what we publish in research articles is actually valid at all. And interestingly, there's also been initiatives trying to replicate previous published research. So this is a publication in eLife that came out a few years ago, but it's reporting on an initiative that sought to replicate published experiments. I think it was based on 20 publications. They were looking at cancer biology research specifically. And what they did is take those papers, try to redo the studies, and see if they could replicate the published results. And what they found is that actually they could only do this in around 46% of the published findings, so it's less than half. Obviously, there may be different reasons for this, but it does signal that there may be an issue there in terms of how are we publishing, what information do we provide, how do we, can we trust the reproducibility and rigor of the published research. So before I move on with this, I just want to ask those here in the audience what your opinion is around this. You must have heard about this label, reproducibility crisis. Just by a show of hands, raise your hand if you think there is a reproducibility crisis in science. What do you think?
Crisis is a strong word. Problem.
Correct, okay, a problem. So shall I reframe? Is there any problem or challenges around reproducibility in science? Okay, I see a couple of people saying yes, the others are that's good as well, because I agree about the concerns on calling this a crisis. It is a crisis, actually. Science is an iterative process, so we are always going to be building on what, on the previous research, etc. So interesting to see this, because in the next slide, I was going to show you what Nature found when they surveyed researchers, and they were much more concerned. This is a survey from several years ago. They did a survey of researchers, 1,500 answered, and 52% said significant crisis. Again, I don't know how they define crisis in that context, but over half of them said significant crisis, and then over a third, a slight crisis. Although, as you can see on the panel farther down, there were differences according to the discipline, so probably there are some issues here in terms of how the reproducibility challenges are viewed that may be also subject to specific chemists and those in the physical and earth sciences, showing more confidence in the results from their fields, and those in medicine and what is labeled as other, which I imagine includes social sciences, and we know all of the issues that have been around psychology research, etc., showing less confidence. So independent of whether we call it a crisis or not, there are some questions and some reflection to do as to how science is being done and reported. So against this context, we've also been hearing a lot of buzz about how many retractions are coming up in the literature. It's important to remind ourselves that actually the number of retractions is a very tiny fraction compared to the number of publications that are coming up, but it is true that the trend, as you can see here, this is based on the information that Retraction Watch collects on the retraction database. The trend is very, very clearly on the rise. This is for the last 20 years or so. And I would expect that the graph continues in the same trend in the last 2-3 years, because there's also been further retractions. To put this in context, we also know that we are publishing more and more papers every year, so you would expect also by normalization, the retractions to go up. But I think that the bottom line is that we are seeing more and more corrections to the published record, which I think is also a positive thing, because not all of this signals misconduct. It may also be efforts from journals to actually get the record cleared up, which is positive. But in context, we are hearing a lot about this, and again, even some stories about alleged misconduct or even proven misconduct are reaching the stories in the media and the press. And the only reason why I highlight this is that there was a lot of attention to this as well in the context of the pandemic, with a lot of research coming up in response to the COVID-19 situation. And this means that it is important for science to bear this in mind and to try to be rigorous, because this type of stories obviously can bring some questions about the trust in science within society as a whole. Right, so all of this we may ask ourselves, why are we seeing this situation? I'm sure you have also heard about the publish or perish culture. The reality is that for scientists, they are, in many settings at least, working within a system that rewards competition over collaboration, and where often what they need to show when they are evaluated for promotions, for new jobs, etc., is to show how many papers have they published, in which journals, and not necessarily the quality of their papers. Essentially, they are being evaluated according to metrics that are often putting emphasis on quantity over quality and being first over being rigorous. So we know that there are some issues there at system level that we will also need to look at going forward. So obviously a very complex system, and research in itself is a complex activity. This means that there can also be a number of a variety of issues that come up in the context of publication ethics. And I wanted to show you a few of the most common ones based on both data from COPE, but also my personal experience as an editor. So this initial graph that I show you is based on cases that are discussed at COPE forums, and it's just listing the top 3 topics for the cases discussed over the last 6 years. And I want to nuance here that COPE forums are attended by journal representatives, so this is reflecting what journal representatives bring to those discussions, to discuss with other peers, other professionals from journals, so that they get advice from them, etc. So it's not necessarily representative of every journal and every publication, but it gives a little bit of a hint as to what journal editors may be worried about. So I thought it may be interesting to show this. Also in terms of how the trends for topics are looking like. So what we see is that there is a consistency across years in terms of having regularly issues raised around post-publication discussions and corrections. I find this very interesting. In the year 2022, with all of the technology we have and the tools available online, it's still very tricky for readers to respond to published papers and for the journals to provide a streamlined process to allow them to do reanalysis, rebuttals, etc. And another regular topic is that of authorship, again, something that can be particularly sensitive at the personal level for individual researchers, and it can take many flavors, so that's also something very common. In terms of things that appear to be being raised more often, we see allegations of misconduct, and things that perhaps are, at least within those forums, are being discussed less over time, relate to intellectual property issues and issues related to how to respond to complaints that journals may receive or appeals on their editorial decisions. So this is based on COPE information, but I also wanted to highlight 3 particular topics that, at least when I was an editor for a number of years, they were the topics that I would say perhaps were coming up most commonly, or at least in terms of numbers. And the first one that I would mention is that of text overlap. So this situation where a submitted manuscript may have fragments of text that overlaps with other published reports. Interestingly, I think this is coming, one of the reasons why this is more common is because journals often now have tools that allow them to systematically screen those submissions and more easily pick up these issues. So it may be a bias there as to whether is this more common by itself, or yes, we have a better tool to pick it up when it happens. Something that is important to mention here is that actually having text overlap in submissions may be totally reasonable and in fact preferable in situations where a group of authors may be publishing different papers that relate to the same study, for example, the same clinical trial, where the methodology is going to be mostly the same with some variation for analytical approaches. But what you want is that transparency of saying all of this comes from the same study. I'm not going to massage the sentences so that they look different just because I want to bypass your tool. There are essentially situations where you expect the authors to repeat the text. But obviously the importance there is the transparency from the authors in saying this is another paper that relates to this publication. It's my own methods information that I have already published. Obviously, this can also be an issue in the context of submissions from authors for whom English is not the first language, because they may try to emulate language that they have seen in other published papers. It's not necessarily they're trying to cheat. It may be a language barrier. So this can be a rather nuanced area, and I wanted to mention briefly, because this may be a particularly useful resource for researchers, that there is a group based in the US called the Text Recycling Research Project, and for full disclosure, I'm on the steering committee for their project. And they have been researching practices in text recycling related to journal publications, but also grant applications. And they have developed a number of resources, not only for researchers, but also for editors, related to editorial policies, etc. So I linked the resources page there. Another very common issue that, again, also came up in the context of the COPE cases is authorship disputes. And the reason why obviously we expect this to be common is that in some cases there are very large collaborative groups. There can be many authors, projects that run over different years with different people involved. And as I mentioned, we are in a system where often researchers are rewarded for their amount of publications. So, is this your first author publication or not? So this can be something quite sensitive and actually important for the individual researcher's career path. So obviously, we expect it to come up. My experience with this is that it can be very varied. Sometimes they forgot somebody who was involved in a project 2 years before. Some other times, somebody has been added to the paper, but then actually that author gets in touch and says, I don't agree with how this has been analyzed. I don't want my name on this paper because I don't want to be responsible for it. Sometimes there is a disagreement as to how the order of authors came up to be. The majority of these cases can be handled in a rather straightforward way if it's something that you say, okay, it's plausible that you forgot this student from several years ago. And the way that the journals handle this is that they will contact the authors for their comments, and if everyone agrees, it's relatively straightforward to change, including after publication, through a correction that explains the issue. When things get complicated is when obviously there is a disagreement, or somebody has left, and then who has oversight over that research and who did what. So in those situations, what journals do is refer the matter to the institution, because at the end of the day, the journals are not equipped to really dig into who did what at each stage of the research process. And one way in which journals have reacted, not necessarily to this, it was also to give more visibility to a broader range of contributions to publications, is the credit taxonomy that has now been implemented by a number of journals. This is a taxonomy that lists a more granular outline of the individual contributions of the author. So there are 14 types of contributions, and now many journals who have implemented this, essentially they list that with the article, also in a machine-readable manner, so it makes all of these contributions more visible. And the third area I wanted to mention, again, because I think this is growing in a scale and in flavors, is the item about issues with published images. There's been a lot of attention to this recently as well, because there are certain researchers who have taken an interest in looking at the integrity of issues and have been raising any concerns that they find with those images with the journals, but also publicly through, for example, platforms such as ASAPbio or even social media networks. But again, my experience with these cases, and I've seen many also raised through whistleblowers, is that the majority is not necessarily an intention to deceive by the author. They were just preparing the image, perhaps went a bit too far in the beautification process because they wanted to make it clearer or with more contrast, etc. So again, if that is the case, it is relatively straightforward to correct it through a correction, but obviously there have also been cases of deliberate manipulation or falsification, put it, Western blot bands when they were not there, etc., pretend that a protein expressed more when they don't have a result to back that up. So those are the ones that are particularly tricky to follow up on, because obviously they can get very, very delicate with the authors. But a number of things that the journals are looking at, because there are now hundreds of publications that have had this issue raised. And I speak from a journal that had quite a few, but I know this is across a number of journals and publishers. A couple of things that I know are happening within the publishing space to try to respond to this, again, at a larger scale system, rather than having editors just comb through papers one by one, is that there are several publishers collaborating and testing software tools to try to, again, have machines help identify this. Obviously, now that we know of a number of published papers impacted, to help with evaluation of those, but in my midterm to try to prevent that even reaching to publication. And the other thing I would mention is that I also know of several journals that what they have put in place is to also now have policies that require that the raw Western blots and gels, so the images for that should be provided with the paper, because in fact what has happened is that for many of the papers that have been flagged with this type of issues, they were published years before all of this data sharing push came to be, and then it becomes very, very tricky to establish if there was a serious issue with the data, or actually it was just, again, this beautification process going a little bit too far. So this push for open sharing of data should also help handle this going forward. Right, so I've talked about a few of the issues that I saw most commonly when I was an editor, but I also wanted to talk about a few of the larger scale issues that are coming up with journals and publishers, because I think what we are seeing now is that we no longer have this situation, I mean, they may still occur, of a particular researcher who wants a promotion and falsifies results somewhere in their corner, and then you look through their 10 publications and kind of, clear the act and move on. What we are seeing now is a larger scale professionalization of some of these issues to address some of the challenges that researchers face in terms of having to deliver publications for promotion or job purposes. So one of the things that has come up is the issue of predatory journals, which you may have heard about. These are journals that operate under open access model, where they require publication fees from the authors. They present themselves as standard traditional open access journal, but in fact what they do is they request this publication fee, but they will not complete peer review, or will do it to a very low standard compared to reputable journals. So we have seen, again, more and more of this come up, in part thanks to the fact that now we have the platforms available for this to be set up relatively easily, but again, due to this pressure to publish on researchers, some of them who may have a time pressure as to when to get their paper out, or a certain number of publications to produce. And the interesting thing for predatory journals is that actually there has been some discussion as to whether they should be called predatory at all, because there are some researchers who will submit to these journals unknowingly, thinking that they are a reputable journal, suitable in their field, essentially as they would submit to any other journal. But there are some researchers that do submit knowingly, because they know that they will pay and get the publication that they are looking for. So essentially, it's a bit of a mixed bag here in terms of what the researcher behavior is. The other item I wanted to mention is that of paper mills, because I think my perspective with this, the sheer scale of the issue is one of the highlights around this. So paper mills are actually companies that will offer the authorship on papers that they have produced, offering invented papers. There may be some that actually do some experiments, but often they are just fake publications. And the authors can pay for a fee and get a paper just like that. Essentially, it will be listed, they will be included in the author list. So the way that in which these companies operate is that they will create these papers, target a number of journals to see where they get a positive response. And once they get that paper accepted, they will place the paper on their company website and offer the authorship slots for a fee. And obviously, as you may expect, the fee for the authorship will vary depending on what's the journal, expected reputation, impact factor, standing in the field, whatever, however we want to refer to that, but also the authorship slots, because as you may expect, first author and corresponding author are more coveted, more important for professional purposes. And the interesting thing here is that because the paper, this arose in certain countries with a very strong pressure for publication, and again, this focus on quantity over quality. It has now expanded to a number of countries, but the interesting thing is that because the company will handle all the correspondence with the journal and prepare all the paper, etc., it means that even though they often sell these papers to authors from countries where English is not the first language, where often as an editor you may say, okay, I see that it's not your first language, I can spot it from how you've written the paper. Actually, these papers are more polished than you would expect from authors in those countries, because they have done the language preparation themselves, etc. Which sometimes means that it may be trickier to spot depending on how you're doing your screening. And to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, because this is not trivial, I wanted to show information from this report that was developed by COPE in collaboration with the International Association of Scientific, Technical and Medical Publishers, the STM, which is an umbrella organization for publishers. They started to look into this, mostly because obviously members of both organizations started to raise issues about this, and they did a number of interviews with representatives of publishers. Again, I'm not going to suggest that this represents every publisher. It was a small sample, but it included some of the big publishers with many journals in their portfolio. And what they came up with is that probably for those people that they spoke to in their journals, they see around 2% of suspected submissions that are actually these fake papers from paper mills. And this is the average. They did different estimates. Again, it varied from 2% all the way to 46%, because the way the companies operate is that they will try different journals, and when one accepts a paper, they just keep coming back and kind of target that journal more systematically. So this is not trivial in terms of numbers, and it also means that as awareness of this has increased within journals, there are more and more papers being flagged, sometimes spotted internally. When I was working on +1, we did spot this type of issue as well, but also because there are some of these researchers who are being very careful about integrity of publications and may have spotted patterns in certain papers that did not make sense according to the author list on the different papers. And now this is a piece in Nature, and it was 2 years ago, that had highlighted 1,400 papers, and I can assure you there have been other papers found since. Right, and the third kind of larger scale element that I wanted to mention is that there has also been activities related to the manipulation of the peer review process within journals. Probably you all know that every journal now has this beautiful online platform where everything is very decentralized. The editor does the thing, the reviewers do their thing, eventually a decision comes of it. This has meant that some very, I guess, clever researchers have spotted potential weaknesses in those online processes and found ways to manipulate the system where they could. This started mostly through this process of journals asking for suggested reviewers. So they could provide, the authors would submit their paper, provide suggestions for reviewers, provide potentially somebody who was a relevant reviewer for their paper with the accurate name, but then create fake email addresses that were coming to the authors, and they would review their own paper, obviously saying that it was fantastic and very positive, and find themselves with an accepted paper when in fact there had not been any external peer review. So this has come up, but actually that was through, for example, authors doing this for themselves, but there has also been examples of collusion between authors and, for example, editors of special issues who had made agreements saying, no, I'll send my paper here, but don't do too much of a peer review, send this to these people who are my mates, or to this address that is a fake address, etc. And again, this is not trivial, because there has been by now hundreds of situations where this has arisen. And again, I'm highlighting the author-suggested reviewers and the specialists mostly because I know of these cases. I've seen examples of the author-suggested reviewers. And I've heard of special issues situations in the sense that the weakness for special issues is that you will often go to a guest editor who is a bit more detached from the journal than the usual members of the editorial board, because you're looking for an expert on a particular topic who will be involved for only a particular period of time. So I'm not saying those are the only reasons or potential weaknesses, but it's something to bear in mind. And one of the steps that journals that have identified this issue, the steps that they have taken is that there are journals that have now actually removed the option of author suggesting reviewers and saying, well, you know, there are many authors who provide very useful and valuable suggestions, but to avoid this kind of issue, they just remove that step altogether from the process. Right, so I've talked a little bit about the trends around seeing this larger scale type of problem. Because this is not trivial, and obviously it can cast a very big question and doubt about the integrity of the process and of the research publications as a whole. But it means that because we are seeing system-level issues at larger scale, there is no single solution that is going to fix them. Is going to require responses that involve all of the stakeholders in the publication process. So I was going to give you a few examples of ways in which not only journals, but members of the research community are trying to respond to some of these problems. One initiative I wanted to make a mention to is Think, Check, Submit, which is essentially a platform, a website that is developing resources to help researchers, I guess, pause and look for relevant signs for reputable journals before they complete the submission. Essentially, the choice of where to submit is the authors, but this aims to give them resources so that they can identify any red flags about papers that may be, journals that may be predatory or may not be running at the standards that you expect from reputable journals. So they have a number of resources on their website, and this is aimed mostly at researcher education. There is also a big push around raising awareness for editors. And again, as I mentioned, some of these issues that we are seeing around paper mills, manipulation of peer review, I think one of the ways in which they managed to get to this extent is the fact that they were targeting different journals. And again, journals sometimes are larger, sometimes are smaller, but the editors often, it's a very solitary role, that of an editor. You know, we are all working in this globalized world, everything is online, we are all doing this separately. So if you're only getting one paper from a paper mill, it may not raise a red flag, because what you need to see is the pattern across submissions on different journals. And obviously we have this confidentiality of the journal process, so it can be very tricky. So the idea here is to try to raise awareness, flag these issues, talk to the editors so that they understand that they need to be on alert for this, and to give them some tools to handle these issues if they come across them. COPE has a number of resources on the website for a very diverse set of issues, but they have also developed resources around the manipulation of peer review, and they are also working actively on paper mills, as I mentioned here, also in collaboration with STM. Another example of this across a stakeholder collaboration is what I was mentioning around responding to image issues. There is, as I mentioned, different publishers have expressed an interest here in trying to leverage technological tools, and STM actually has a working group looking just at this to try to develop some recommendations. But also another thing that they are quite interested in is to try to get different publishers to provide examples of the issues that they are seeing, so that you can actually train those software tools as comprehensively as possible, so that they can improve them to help them address these issues. So it's one of the examples of how they are trying to bring different publishers together who often, you know, have their processes and may even compete with each other. But they are trying to get them to work together on this, because obviously they are all affected. Right, another example of a situation where different stakeholders are coming together is that COPE has been working with institutional representatives, trying to bring them more involved into their projects, because they realize, as I mentioned, for authorship disputes, journals are limited into how far they can get. They need to refer cases to institutions and then act per the recommendation. Any situations where, for example, misconduct is suspected is the same situation. The editor is there to check the integrity of the paper, but the misconduct is a matter that relates to the institutional processes to follow up on. So they have been working with institutions. There is this recommendation, the CLUE guidelines, that talks about collaboration between journals and institutions on anything related to publication ethics. But another interesting development is that COPE, that has traditionally been for journals and publishers, has, after a pilot where they were working with a small number of institutions, has now opened up membership for institutions to join, to try to get them more involved again on how we can find processes that work for both journals and institutions around these issues. Okay, so we've talked about a number of issues around publication ethics, which sound a bit, I guess, a bit doom and gloom, but not everything is lost. One thing that I wanted to mention here that has also come up in different conversations around this is that a lot of these issues that we are talking about often are identified by the time that the paper has gone through the journal process and is published, which means that by that time there's been several years of work by several researchers and a lot of things are happening in between, but suddenly we have this polished, shiny paper and everything focuses on that. And a question that we can ask ourselves is that is that not a little bit too late in the process? Because obviously science is complex, involves many people, there are many things that have gone up before, and pretending that we can try to resolve every possible issue at the very end with the journal article is a little bit tricky. So I guess the case I want to make here is that actually, even though we had discussed very serious issues related to breaches in publication ethics, the most pervasive issues are actually not necessarily intentional bad behavior of researchers trying to cheat. It's actually that we have some issues as to how research is implemented, how researchers are trained, and what the publication practices are. And we see many issues where, consciously or unconsciously even, researchers may introduce reproducibility issues on their work because of different concerns. Again, for example, until very recently, it was rare that research publications would include the data. I mean, I was on +1 when we implemented the policy, and there was a lot of pushback at the time. And that was less than 10 years ago. While now we have this expectation in certain disciplines to always provide the data so that we can scrutinize. But I mean, traditionally, for the majority of the published papers, we don't have the data because, I mean, we've been publishing for many years. Same thing for the methodological information. You know, refer to this published paper from 40 years ago. If you can find it, let's see. Issues around the study design, analytical approaches, all of this drive to find positive results, you know, torture data until you give me the positive result that supports my hypothesis. And all of these issues around publication bias. We know there's been a strong push for essentially the positive results are more valuable, are more impactful, so your negative results, and sometimes again this is even researchers making tough choices as to where to put their effort and their time in saying I may not just pursue publishing this negative result because it will take me a long time, it will be tricky, etc. So we have also issues around publication bias. So all of this is quite tricky, but I would say probably more pervasive than all the other issues that we've mentioned before, and we can ask ourselves, what can we do about this? And my answer is that open science can give us a lot of tools to address the most pervasive issues. I want to explore a few things about open science, but before that I wanted to highlight the fact that you may have heard about this, but I found this very exciting. UNESCO actually issued recommendations around open science in November last year, which I think will be highly influential because this expects the UNESCO member countries to pay attention to open science and start thinking about developing and implementing policies. So I think we're going to see a lot of efforts in that direction coming in the next few years. But a few highlights as to why open science is important. At the core of open science is developing more collaboration among researchers, essentially opening up so that you can collaborate with others and get comments from others and be more rigorous because you're going to get more eyes on your work as you are developing it and not at the very end after years of work. And all of this transparency means that we also have more accountability and we can increase also society's trust in science. So a few areas of open science that I wanted to explore here. The first is that we mentioned issues around the amount of information we have for methods. There are now ways in which researchers can share their methodology early on, even before they do any pieces of their research. There is an initiative started by the Center of Open Science around pre-registration of studies, which means that you can develop your idea, your hypothesis, and say, I'm going to complete my research this way and analyze it this way, and then just post that publicly or even publish it in journals that consider registered reports, and essentially have that up to scrutiny and make yourself accountable as to how you will analyze your data once you collect it later. A second important area is, of course, the sharing of data. We need more of those data shared for all the elements of scrutiny, etc., but also because data by themselves should be recognized as a research object by themselves. And here I want to highlight the importance of depositing data sets in repositories. Of course, there is a lot of journals now that have policies around open data, which is great. They require data sharing. But to make data as usable as possible, repositories provide the best option. They will provide DOIs as citable objects for the data, and they ensure that similar data from similar studies and disciplines are hosted together in perpetuity. And then the third area that sorry, before I move on, I also want to mention very briefly, as I mentioned, I've been involved in a working group that has been looking at data publication issues, and I mention this because I think it will be something that we are going to see coming up with different research objects, and is that with this push for sharing more data, we are also now seeing potential ethical and even legal issues arising around data specifically, whether they have an associated journal article or not, because obviously repositories are hosting now thousands and thousands of data sets. So we started this work with a number of collaborators and a very close collaboration with representatives of data repositories, who are the ones who are having to handle these issues now. To try to develop some recommendations that were specific to data publication. Again, COPE has a lot of resources for journal articles, but we are now seeing new issues around research data, so I encourage you to have a look. We posted these recommendations publicly on Zenodo, and we outline a number of recommendations for follow-up on different issues, for published data, unpublished data, how to handle the communication between repositories and journals, etc. But there's obviously, this is still early stages of how things are developing for data, so we expect to see much more discussion within the community as to how some of the practices will evolve. For example, should we call a data set that you need to withdraw or remove a retraction, even though journals call themselves, when you correct the record, you call it a retraction. It may not be applicable for a data set that doesn't have interpretation. So a lot of open questions still here. And the third area that I wanted to explore with you, as you may have expected, I do a lot of work on preprints, so I wanted to also talk about preprints a little bit. I think they are a great tool, very versatile tool for open science, because they put the control back on the researchers as to what they can share with the community and when they can share it with the community. This means that you don't have to wait to have your fully polished, shaped research results that you're going to submit to a journal. You can actually post any result that you think is ready, properly reported, supported, backed up, etc. But you may want to share it before you submit it to a journal. Preprints allow you to do this and are a great way of opening up that research life cycle and sharing outputs earlier than journal publication. Very briefly, for those of you who may be a bit less familiar with preprints, essentially, preprints are copies of research manuscripts. They can be, again, the copy that may be submitted to a journal later, that are uploaded by the researchers themselves onto an online platform called preprint servers. And what the server will do is that they will do a light screening of the research to check that it's actually research and there is nothing hugely wrong with it. But otherwise, they will not complete peer review. They will do that check and then post the manuscript as the author has provided it online publicly. Usually it takes a matter of days. In some servers it's immediate. And this means that that same manuscript that then may be submitted to a journal and undergo a very valuable but usually lengthy review process. That paper is already available within days for the community to use it for their own research, provide comments and engage with it. And then obviously a lot of journals accept submissions that have been posted at preprints, so the preprints are journal compatible, and then the authors can go through the usual scrutiny of the peer review process and take the time that it needs. That's fine, because they already have their paper publicly available for the community. And another thing that I wanted to mention here is that I think preprints can also play a strong role in the element of reproducibility. As I mentioned, we know in the context of journal publications, we may have issues like the drawer file effect. Essentially, all of these results that researchers produce, and then they say, I don't have time to write this up, I'm going to move jobs, so it doesn't fit in the paper for the journal because they tell me no more than X number of words, etc. So there is a lot of results that are not being published in the current traditional system. And it also means that even for those journals where they may have open science policies requesting data, code, or other information, that will only be available once the peer-reviewed article appears months or years after the initial submission. If we bring preprints into the system, as I mentioned, the researcher can choose when to share that work with the community. It appears in a matter of days, but also preprint servers they don't do peer review, they also don't have expectations, or they don't make evaluations according to advanced novelty, impact, etc. So provided that it's research and it fits their guidelines, they will post it. It means that it's relatively easy for an author to also report through preprints any negative results, replications, confirmatory studies, rebuttals for other papers, responses to published papers, all of that. And this can help us share those results with the community and help tackle publication bias. Another advantage in terms of this scrutiny on scientific work at different stages of the research life cycle relates to the fact that by virtue of that speed of dissemination, it allows the authors to get potential comments and feedback from the community. Even if the server themselves don't complete peer review, the other researchers in their field, they may see the paper, provide comments, suggestions, correct oversights, etc. So this can be a way of, again, increasing that reproducibility and rigor of the paper. And an example of this happening in real life that I wanted to share is a preprint that was posted, I think it was 2021. It reported some results from a trial involving patients with COVID-19 and an intervention to treat those patients. And the authors posted the paper as a preprint on a platform operated by The Lancet. It's called Preprints with The Lancet. And shortly after the paper appeared there were responses from the community saying, we had some questions about how you are reporting your clinical trial, how it was designed. Does the analysis really match the study design that you are reporting here? So there were quite a few comments related to the paper, also questions and interactions through social media. And what happened was that the platform actually solicited a fast-track review from one of those commenters online and decided to remove the preprint on the basis of those concerns. But the interesting part here, because I don't think we should think about this as a negative experience, is the fact that the same authors, several months later, did go on to publish that same paper about the same trial in a journal, following peer review, the traditional process, etc. And when you come to that paper in the journal, the authors had addressed the concerns on the preprint. So essentially, they had taken that feedback on board, improved their paper, and ended up appearing in a peer-reviewed journal. So again, this is an example of how that feedback from the community can be valuable and relatively quick when it works in that manner and help improve the final journal publication. A couple of other brief things that I wanted to mention in the context of preprints that may be relevant. I'm not sure about integrity, but also in the context of many open science conversations that are happening in the context of recent developments from the US and elsewhere around pushes for open science that I think they are very positive. One thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that preprints are free to post. Essentially, there is no submission or publication fee for the authors. They don't run APCs. And they are also not operating under any subscription. So essentially, any reader with an internet connection can go to a preprint server and access those papers. Essentially, €0 to post and €0 to access, which can be a useful way to address some of the potential inequities that we see within open access and some of the models that run on article processing charges. Because what you can do is two ways with your preprint, is either post the preprint early and apply an open license. The license options are up for the author depending on the server, but you can apply an open license and that's already made openly available. Or there are some servers that will allow you to take, as an author, take the copy of the paper that has undergone peer review, but before it has appeared and is fully prepared, formatted by the journal, and take that copy and submit it to a preprint server, is what they call the author-accepted paper, and that's the green open access path. So essentially, you're making that copy not formatted, fine, but the content is there, publicly, openly available for essentially $0 charge, and it will be open access in green open access. Right, and very briefly, I wanted to also mention an initiative from ASAPbio, because we also think that another interesting element of preprints that they don't only give control to researchers for the dissemination of their work, but they also give reviewers some control as to what to do with the reviews if they want to transparently share those. So we are running this Publish Your Reviews initiative, where what we do is we invite reviewers who are reviewing for journals to take their review, and if the paper that they have reviewed has a preprint, to post the review on the preprint, because that will make your copy of the review transparent and openly available, independent of whether the journal runs a model where they publish the reviews or not. And it also means that you can share that review earlier and independent of whether the journal accepts or rejects the paper, etc. So there is more information on the website where we invite reviewers to sign a pledge and commit to doing this, and as well as additional resources as to how we recommend to complete that deposition of the review with the preprint. Right, and with that, before I finish, I just wanted to share a few thoughts as to things that may be coming up after exploring all of these issues and developments. I think one of the highlights here that we are going to see in the short term is that there is going to continue this push for open science. We're going to see many elements of research becoming more open, which I think will bring a lot of benefits. But again, we are likely going to see new issues arising that we didn't imagine in the context of journals, because we will have a diverse set of outputs, and this will need new community conversations to develop best practices to address any challenges. As we mentioned, a lot of the issues here, individual or systemic, are often related to how research assessment is at the minute. And how this is essentially the frameworks that researchers work with in many settings. So I think there needs to be some reflection around that in many institutions and countries, and also we are seeing interesting moves, for example, within certain funders who have a strong focus on open research and who are looking very hard as to how they are going to be bringing open science practices into their evaluation processes, and essentially say, if we value rigor and open science, it needs to come as part of the reward system and not be an aside that researchers do for the greater good. Something else that I think we're going to see as well is efforts, certainly within journals and publishers, in trying to streamline some of these processes. Again, handling 1,000 retractions, it cannot be the same as handling one retraction. There needs to be this system-level response that makes sure that we can correct the record in a more efficient way in terms of resources, but also in a more timely way, because we know that also currently we are experiencing some challenges as to how long it takes to correct that record. And then again, continued collaboration across the stakeholders. We need to bring everyone along the way, because this will need input from everybody, education for researchers, input from institutions, obviously initiatives by funder publishers, but also everyone else who is going to support open science infrastructure, such as data repositories and associated platforms. Right, and that's all I had for today. Thank you so much for listening, and very happy to have any comments or questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know if the there's any questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Iratxe.
Couple of comments or questions. I work in human population genomics. Data there are extremely sensitive, so we need gatekeepers. And there's obvious this tension between the need and the will of making data available and respecting the privacy of the volunteers who gave their essence, their genomes, and sometimes alongside with their health information, and there's a tension there. Also, on the issue of preprints, we may need a couple of cultural changes from reviewers and editors who quite often will not consider preprints as real papers and will not allow others to cite preprints in their manuscripts. So this needs to be addressed, and some educational efforts need to be done on that. And another stakeholder that needs to be educated about preprints are communication officers, who are sometimes at a loss to decide when to promote a paper, when it's a preprint. And sometimes there can be a conflict with the journal, especially if that's a high impact journal. They may want to publicize the paper when they publish it, but that has been scooped in a sense because the institution may have already publicized it when it was first appeared as a preprint. So there's lots of little cultural changes to be done there.
Absolutely, and thank you for raising that. It's very relevant, and I could not agree more. I guess on I'll try to remember all the items, but let me know if I miss anything. The first item around data sharing, I totally agree. I don't think we should go into this as, share everything at all cost, independent on frameworks. This is something that as part of the working group that I mentioned, we've been discussing. Actually, we have a specific section around issues related to risk to participants or privacy issues, etc. So I think that important thing there is to realize that it may not look the same for every discipline and for every data set, and something that, for full disclosure, I'm involved with the Dryad data repository, but something that we care a lot about in that repository is the fact that there is a curation step for the data set. Essentially, it's not like you dump your data set, it appears beautifully online and no questions asked. There is a process there to check, is there anything here that we need to pay attention to, work with the authors about, any identifying issues, etc. So I absolutely agree, and this is again an area where different disciplines probably will need to bring together their knowledge and develop practices around that. For the preprints, I agree. Essentially, we do a lot of work with preprints, and it may sound like preprints have been going on forever because there was so much talk about COVID and bioRxiv and medRxiv, but actually in the life sciences they are relatively new, and it's still a minority of papers and a minority of researchers that post preprints. So there is going to need to be a cultural shift there. And again, another area where we are seeing disparities across disciplines. For some disciplines, like, yeah, of course, what's the deal with preprints, while some others are like, it may not work for me. I want to do peer review first because I may have some data that is related to patients and I want to be extra careful, or there may be different reasons. So this is why for us in ASAPbio, what we want is to put an emphasis on that productive use of preprints, of saying what we want is to give information to researchers on what are the benefits, what they can get out of them, what are the things to bear in mind. Again, it's not do it at all costs, and we'll see later. So I think it's true. Same thing for editors, it's true. There are some journals that don't accept preprints. Luckily, they are now a minority. I work a lot with researchers in the ASAPbio community, and I've had anecdotes of them saying, no, I submitted to this journal that has a pro-preprint policy. The editor told me it came in the plagiarism check, reject. And my advice to those researchers is always to say, you go and call it out. Because essentially this editor is not following their own policy, and probably they will appreciate being reminded that they have this policy, or they may need to learn about preprints a bit more. So we don't need to make a big fuss, but it's an opportunity to educate the editor constructively. So yes, I think the important thing is to continue having these conversations.
Thanks very much. I'm very keen on open science as well and all of this stuff, and I think it's very important. But I have two, I guess, specific questions. So when a number of the journals started making their peer review process more open or possible for the reviewers to state who they are and make it public, this all seemed like a fantastic thing. And then I was talking to some editors of some other journals, very high quality journals, who said, well, actually, we feel that we need to protect some of our younger, more junior group leaders or contributors in this, because fields, communities are very human places, and there's big names and sort of imposing people. And so that's another example of something that maybe we have to explicitly protect the privacy of people in this actual process. And you mentioned, for example, putting reviews on sort of preprint servers as well. I wasn't sure whether you meant that you could, this could be reviews that people had done for an actual journal, because presumably that's not. But the journal allows that? I mean, so a journal can.
Essentially, the review is the reviewer's intellectual property. So, I mean, I've done this myself, but I just told the editor I'm going to post my review.
Well, that even a journal that, with its own rules, insists on anonymity to the authors?
On the preprint, it's not compulsory to sign it.
Well, so that's technically interesting. But of course, there are cases where maybe the reviewer's anonymity should be protected. Otherwise, they can't do their job.
Yes, for full disclosure, I sign my reviews, but I realize I'm a privileged person. I'm not on the tenure track, etc. So I have that philosophical standpoint. But I'm not a good example, but I just want to mention this for my bias. I agree completely that there may be risks in asking particularly early career researchers to expose themselves in this way by signing a review for somebody who may be more senior and with whom they may have a job interview in the future. I'm totally aware of that. I guess that for ASAPbio, what we drive is transparency in the review, but we are not saying sign or not sign. You can post the reviews publicly, so what some journals call transparent peer review, maybe it's a clearer term, where you post the reviews, but you only have the names if the reviewers have chosen themselves to sign.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, the other question is a bit related to maybe the quote that you've got up there, which is, in a way, you've talked a lot about the mechanics of things, but the bigger issue maybe is the underlying incentive structure in the community. And so I was wondering what your opinion is of DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, and whether that's one of the things that's useful more for not, the mechanisms, but for reducing all of this biased incentivization of people to scoop each other, to, all of this stuff. Because fundamentally, if jobs depend on still impact factors and things like that, all these mechanisms are going to be constantly fighting against something, but that thing is just going to stay there unless we change the incentivization structure. So you didn't mention DORA, but is DORA important?
Thank you for, I don't know if this works. Thank you for raising DORA. I'm a great supporter, and actually in ASAPbio we have collaborated with DORA on different things because we have certain values and alignment of aspects of our mission. For example, when you think DORA says, evaluate a paper for the paper and not by its impact factor, well, bioRxiv does not have an impact factor. So you are forced to evaluate the preprint for the preprint and not by the label that may go somewhere. So I think DORA is doing a fantastic job. And it's been hugely influential, and I hope they will continue in that path. And the interesting thing that I think for DORA is that it's not only saying, oh, let's forget about impact factors and let's figure it out later. They are providing very tangible alternatives as to how institutions can do assessment through narrative CVs and other ways to address part of that. I think as many things that we have discussed, it requires culture change. It's not going to be forever. Even institutions that are signatories to DORA don't necessarily have ticked all the boxes of what you are supposed to do for implementation. And the other thing, I mean, just this week I was in a workshop with researchers and discussing preprints and similar things. And it is true that some of them mention, well, even if you tell me I'm going to do this in a journal-blinded fashion, you cannot prevent somebody thinking, oh, I think actually this has gone to journal that I shall not name. So it is true, we need to continue work here, providing alternatives, because at the end of the day, why are so many institutions using impact factors? Because we all know that 5 is more than 3. So I don't have to bother reading the paper. Essentially, I'm just offloading this work on this number that somebody else has provided to me. So yeah, it's a bit more work, but how can we find alternatives that do not overload the system? And also address this element of, even if we tell people, don't go by the journal title, how do we handle this unconscious biases? So essentially more training for researchers, more guidance for grant reviewers, more guidance for those who are recruiting researchers, etc. So quite a bit of work ahead, I think.
There was another question there.
I'm going to ask anyway. So following on preprints, so as the name of the authors go public, basically you are preventing blind peer reviews on the papers. So I guess what do you think about if there is a bias when the big institutions, elite researchers won't have like a blind peer review?
Yeah, so it is true. If you post a preprint, essentially very tricky to be compatible with double-blind review. I guess that my answer to that's true. Essentially, I'm not going to say workarounds. What I could say is that I come from my training is in a discipline where there is very little double-blind. It was more single-blind or transparent peer review. I know there are some disciplines where it is very common to do double-blind, but my experience with that, also speaking to reviewers who have operated in double-blind, is that even if you say, oh, you don't give me the name, everyone starts to make guesses, correct or incorrect. So you create a different bias in a different way, because essentially, oh, this person has these 5 papers by the same group in the author list. So essentially, it's either the authors or their collaborators. So I really more or less, I'm in a very close circle here. So it is true that I understand the potential benefits of double-blind for, again, same issue, underrepresented groups or young researchers, but I'm not sure that's the essentially final answer. And from my perspective, what I would like to see in science is this more polite and constructive dialogue. So I wouldn't want to, as I mentioned, I sign my reviews. I rather own my comments and be polite and own them and have a conversation that somebody can respond to, rather than say, I'm not going to say my name, I don't know who the author is, I don't want them to know who I am. But I may be biased by the discipline that I was trained in and the journals I worked on, because again, I didn't do double-blind.
Okay, I just wanted to mention also that I completely agree with what James said. Not every single discussion about research integrity or any kind of this, all the issues you mentioned can be changed if we change the incentives, because they're all caused by the same thing. But it's just it's really hard. But in that sense, you mentioned there's definitely a push towards open science, which is also a very good way of being more transparent and saving on all of this, or at least making them more obvious if they happen. So you mentioned the UNESCO, and then there's the White House mandate, very recently, to make all federally funded research and the data behind the publication available straight away, immediately. I think that's, I don't know what if you want to say something about it, and I think it's great, but I think you mentioned quite a few potential challenges when trying to make data available. And there's even more. There's the money and the time, because a preprint is free, but then, as you say, if you want to put your data in a repository, there's a lot of work behind that, and things that you have to think from the very beginning also. So yeah.
Sure, a lot to unpack. I'll say I was overjoyed to see the OSTP memo that came out, because again, in another conversation earlier this week, I was asking several people in this space, what do you think about the memo? And essentially they all said it was about time, like, Coalition S was there several years ago. So I think it will be a very positive thing, because at the end of the day, again, it comes from an institution who will influence the main funder in the world. So it is going to be highly influential. And in the United States, they will take notice, and obviously they collaborate with many other researchers across the globe. I think it's fantastic. Having said that, it is true that there are, as with many other things, potential unintended consequences. And I guess one of the most discussed, or at least what I hear from publishers and journals, is this element of saying, okay, so there will no longer be an embargo, publications need to be available immediately. But does it mean that every journal will now flip into the gold open access model and then impose these exorbitant article processing fees with all of the financial inequities and other that we know about, which is obviously a risk. I think that the important thing here is to bear in mind that the memo doesn't dictate what the business model should be. So essentially, green open access is totally available for any researchers that may say, I don't have funding, or I philosophically disagree to pay $10,000 to publish my paper open access, which I think is understandable. So I think one of the things will be to watch how the implementation goes. The devil is always in the detail, but that collectively we try to make sure that there is a diversity of paths to open access. Essentially, it doesn't all mean paying a very high cost for having the paper in gold. For data, I think that the memo is very interesting because probably it may have gone beyond, I mean, the NIH was already going there and they have a policy, but it really reinforces that. But I agree that the memo doesn't say how this is going to be paid for. So what I would like to see there is certainly a stronger collaboration with repositories, because the infrastructure is there. They just need the extra push to make sure that we can scale and again account for the diversity. But there are a number of repositories that have very strong processes, again, curation, they can support researchers. And the best path, in my view, is to encourage those repositories to work with the institutions so that researchers have that support. And there is a lot of librarians now in a number of institutions in the US who are moving into this space of supporting researchers with their data management plans and the positions. So exciting times ahead. Again, we'll have to watch how it develops, but I think it will be important to bear that diversity in mind and remind ourselves that the memo doesn't say how to do it. So let's try to bring everyone along.
Thank you. I have one last question, if anyone. So, do you have, like, since you are involved in these data repositories also, do you have any 5 tips to researchers who want to make their data open, things that they have to take into account, like from the very beginning?
Yes. Well, I don't know if I can come up with 5. Let's see how many if I take all the boxes. I mean, one of the main things, as with so many things in science, is be proactive about this. Think about this early on. A data management plan sounds like an incredible burden and so boring, but actually it saves you a lot of grief down the line. So essentially, be proactive about this, and do check. Again, if there is support available, there are a number of universities, at least in the UK where I'm based, and again in the US, where you can have support for this. Essentially, you don't have to figure this out on your own. Go to those who will help you. And start that way. I would say, like, being proactive and taking it in small chunks. You see, it's always easier if you plan ahead and you store your data as you should at every step of the way. If I had some other tips, something else I would encourage as well, researchers to do if they're interested in this, because it may be a more fun side of things. This data thing can be a lot of work. There is a lot of open data communities out there of very cool young people who care about this and are running initiatives or help each other, or develop resources, share tips, what worked for you, what didn't. You don't have to reinvent the wheel for your own research. So I would encourage you to have a look, because there is a lot of groups who are doing, again, interesting things, and they are fun people to be with. So that can be a way of also increasing your network, etc. And then I guess if I had to think of another tip is, I would say, be vocal about it. I think there is a lot of reputational value to presenting yourself as an open science advocate, because that's the direction of travel. Essentially, this is going to become more and more important. So be vocal about it, and again, get together with others who care about this, but explain that that's your philosophy and that you care about it and that you're doing it. I think it can bring reputational and professional value to individual researchers. So I don't think I did 5, I did 3.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Iratxe. And if there's no more questions, we'll leave it here. Thank you, everyone.